What's going on guys, Slavey here and welcome to my very first New World guide. Today we will go over all the classes within the game and more importantly everything you need to know about the weapon system. At the end of this video you will have a fast understanding about the weapons in New World, and by then you will also know which weapons you would like to play. Among the 11 weapons in New World you have 3 one-handed weapons, which are the sword, rapier and hatchet, 3 two-handed weapons, which are the spear, great axe and warhammer, 2 ranged weapons, which are the bow and musket, and 3 magic weapons, which are the fire staff, life staff and the ice gauntlet. Although there are multiple one-handed weapons and you can equip a shield anytime you want to, it will only be usable whenever you wield a sword. Therefore it's advised not to have a shield equipped if you don't use a sword, since it will only add weight to your character. Each one of these 11 weapon masteries are separate from one another. This means you can level each one of them to the max level, which is awesome since it doesn't limit you in your options and you can change your weapons anytime you like to. And all you have to do to level a weapon is simply use it during combat and gain experience with it. But of course there is an advantage to choosing your weapons early on, which is that you can level them to higher levels faster, which will grant you access to various passives and make those weapons much stronger. Think of passives such as additional range, cooldown reduction, buffs, debuffs and even lifesteal. Now you might have noticed I said weapons in plural, and that's because you can actually equip 2 different weapons simultaneously. In fact, weapon swapping during combat between the 2 weapons you have equipped is a major part of your gameplay. Each weapon you have equipped will only have access to 3 active abilities, so by weapon swapping actively you will be able to utilize a total of 6 of them. If we click on one of the weapon masteries, we will see various interesting things. First of all, at the bottom left we will see what attribute the weapon we selected scales with, and this is important because different weapons scale with different attributes. Some weapons even have a primary and a secondary attribute they scale with. Therefore, to utilize your points as best as possible, you may want to select a combination of weapons that benefit from the same attribute. Although within this matter, the life staff for example is the only weapon that benefits from focus, and if you want to be a pure healer, you probably want to put your points in there. Therefore your secondary weapon could be for support purposes, in which you go for something like the ice gauntlet for crowd control and defenses. Another interesting thing within the weapon masteries is that each one of them has 2 different skill trees. If we take the sword and shield for example, we can see the first part is swordmaster and the second part is defender. Something I think is really cool is that you can already unlock all 3 active abilities with your first 3 points. So after farming mobs for just a short period, you can already try a weapon out and get a feel for it. And since respecking your points is free until level 20, you can try out both paths to see which one you like more. Or perhaps you're someone that likes a combination of the 2 paths. You can actually mix and match the points you have available to you between the 2 weapon trees. The possibility to do this, combined with the selection of any of the 2 weapons, makes for a lot of freedom and creativity in which you can fully create your personal and unique builds. Do know that at the max level of a weapon mastery, you will have a total of 20 points to spend, meaning you can't unlock all the actives and passives and you have to be selective when forming your final specialization. But as I said before, you can freely respec your points until level 20, which is plenty of time to try out different things and see what you end up liking. After level 20 you will still be able to respec, but it won't be free any longer. Now we have a fast understanding of the weapon system. Let's dive into the 11 different weapons and see what type of playstyle they make for. Starting with the sword and shield, we are looking at a melee weapon that scales with strength and dexterity. The 2 weapon trees are swordmaster and defender. Swordmaster has access to whirling blade, reverse stab and leaping strike. These abilities are centered around damage, with leaping strike having a tiny gap closer to it. As you level the swordmaster tree, you will get various bonuses that increase your damage even more, which makes swordmaster the ideal choice if you want to be on the offense as an aggressive damage dealer. Then we have defender, which has access to shield rush, field dash and defiant stance. These abilities make for mobility, a good amount of crowd control and tankiness. As you level this tree, you will get additional crowd control, buffs and debuffs and even some healing. The passives in this tree really build up on what already is a very tanky set of abilities. Therefore the defender is an excellent tree for anyone who would like to play as a tank. With the rapier we're looking at a weapon that scales with dexterity and intelligence. The 2 weapon trees are blood and grace. Blood has access to Tondo, flurry and flourish and finish. These abilities are pretty interesting because they make for multiple forms of damage. First of all, there is direct damage, secondly there's damage over time, and then you have damage that builds up as you use your ability for longer. Leveling Blood will also add burst damage to this list, whilst granting you various forms of utility. If you want to play as a very swift DPS with fast attacks and various forms of damage, you definitely want to play Blood. Then we have Grace, which has Evade, Riposte and Flash. These abilities make for mobility, invulnerability and counter attacks that can stun your enemies. Leveling this tree will grant you various buffs that make you much stronger and allow you to put even more pressure on your enemies. The Grace tree is a very versatile one that's centered around reacting to your enemies' actions and punishing them whenever you see an opportunity. If you like to punish your enemies for their mistakes, you definitely want to go with Grace. Then we have the Hatchet, which is the third and final one-handed weapon on the list that also scales with strength and dexterity, just like the sword. The weapon trees for this weapon are Berserker and Throwing. Berserker has access to Berserk, Feral Rush and Raging Torrent. These abilities make for a damage buff, a leap and damage. Leveling this tree will make for a bunch of perks. I don't think I've seen any other tree that offers so many different things. The most interesting part about this tree probably is the ultimate, which is Defy Death, that grants you 50 HP and immortality for 3 seconds in what would otherwise kill you, which makes this tree live up to its name, in which the abilities really represent a Berserker-like playstyle. The second tree, Throwing, has access to Rending Throw, Social Distancing and Infected Throw, which makes for a ranger playstyle with debuffs to it that's very different from Berserker. As you go about leveling this tree, you will make your debuffs much stronger, whilst giving yourself various forms of utility. If you want a ranger playstyle where you throw your hatchets to debuff and hinder your enemies, Throwing will be an amazing pick for that purpose. Time to delve into the two-handed weapons, with the first one being the Spear. This weapon scales with dexterity and strength, and the weapon trees are Zoner and Impaler. Zoner will give you access to Javelin, Sweep and Cyclone. What's interesting about this combination of abilities is that you have a mix of ranged and melee. On top of that, you also have a good amount of crowd control. As you level this tree, you will mostly get more crowd control and even more damage. An ideal tree to overwhelm your enemies with CC whilst doing a fair bit of damage at the same time. Then we have Impaler, which has access to Skewer, Perforate and Vault Kick. These abilities are a mix of damage, bleed, debuffs and CC. Leveling this tree will make the effects of the abilities much stronger, whilst granting you multiple forms of bonuses. If you want to be a jack of all trades but not excel in a specific area, I think the Impaler tree will be something for you. The second two-handed weapon is the Great Axe, which scales with strength. The two weapon trees are Reaper and Molar. Reaper will give you access to Reap, Charge and Execute. This makes for a combination of gap closers and damage. As you level the Reaper tree, you will be rewarded with various buffs that make you faster and increase your damage, additional hits to your abilities and even some healing. So if you want to play something that can keep close to enemies with some self-sustain and a fair amount of damage, Reaper will be up your alley. Then we have the Molar tree, which will give you access to Maelstrom, Whirlwind and Gravity Well. These abilities are great to group your enemies together and do AoE damage. Leveling this tree will make for even more CC, increased damage and buffs to not only you but also your allies. So with the Molar tree, you're looking at a lot of AoE damage and control. The third and final two-handed weapon is the Warhammer, which, just like the Great Axe, scales with strength. The two weapon trees are Juggernaut and Crowd Crusher. Juggernaut has access to Armor Breaker, Mighty Gavel and Wrecking Ball. These abilities make for a good amount of damage with some debuffs and interruption. As you level this tree, your abilities will become unstoppable and your debuff effects will be much stronger. If you want to play as a Juggernaut, this weapon tree is simply perfect for you, since it does a good amount of damage whilst making the fight difficult for your enemies. The second tree, Crowd Crusher, will unlock Clear Out, Shockwave and Path of Destiny. These abilities will make for noticeable AoE damage and CC. Leveling this tree will add debuffs, increase the radius of your effects, provide various forms of utility for you and your allies, and you will even have a bit of self-healing. This simply makes for a weapon tree that will control the state of the battlefield enormously through the crowd control and debuffs it has access to. Then we have our first ranged weapon, which is the bow that scales with dexterity. The two weapon trees of the bow are Skirmisher and Hunter. Skirmisher has access to Evade Shot, Rain of Arrows, and Poison Shot. And honestly, the abilities pretty much do exactly what their names say. You're looking at ranged abilities that will do both direct damage and damage over time, whilst also giving you some kiting utility. As you level Skirmisher, your damage will increase, you will get debuffs to your abilities, and the effects of your dots will become stronger. You're pretty much looking at your traditional bow class within MMORPGs, where it's about kiting and keeping your range as you go about doing damage. Then we have the Hunter tree, which has access to Penetrating Shot, Splinter Shot, and Rapid Shot. And this tree is much more about pure ranged damage. Leveling Hunter will increase your damage by a ton and even add extra arrows to your abilities. The Hunter tree really is about pure ranged damage. Unlike Skirmisher, you don't really have utility and buffs to kite with, so it's even more important you keep your distance and you go about unleashing your arrows. Then we have our second ranged weapon, which is the Musket. This weapon scales with Dexterity and Intelligence, and the two weapon trees are Sharpshooter and Trapper. Sharpshooter grants access to Power Shot, Powder Burn, and Shooter Stance. These abilities will simply enhance your shots for more damage and additional effects. Leveling this tree will make for more damage, increased effects, and various buffs. Good to mention is the ultimate, which is Sniper, that adds an optional zoom when you aim, whilst granting you extra damage on your headshots. This makes the Sharpshooter the ideal tree for anyone that wants to kill enemies from afar, with a pretty unique playstyle to it. Trapper on the other hand has access to Traps, Stopping Power, and Sticky Bomb. Whilst also making for ranged gameplay, this weapon tree brings a lot of crowd control to the table that will keep your enemies away from you. As you level Trapper, you will also start debuffing your enemies, have access to more traps, and have a huge increase to your damage. If you want a ranged playstyle with some additional toys that will make your enemies' lives much harder, the Trapper tree is definitely one you want to look into. Then we have the three magic weapons, starting with the Fire Staff. This weapon scales with Intelligence, and the two weapon trees are Fire Mage and Pyromancer. Fire Mage has access to Pillar of Fire, Meteor Shower, and Fireball. These abilities make for damage and leave fire areas on the ground that continue doing damage to anyone that stands upon them. Leveling this weapon tree will make for more damage and increased duration of your AoEs. Your ultimate will make for one more AoE that increases your damage when you stand on it. So you're simply looking at your traditional Fire Mage that you can find in any MMO that does damage with fire, causes burning, and has a bunch of AoE. The second tree, Pyromancer, will give you access to Flamethrower, Incinerate, and Burn Out. And this tree, in my opinion, gets much more interesting. Whilst this tree is still about damage, just like Fire Mage, it also makes for crowd control, more emphasis on dot damage, and even mobility. Leveling this weapon tree will add lifesteal, make for additional dots and hits, and various buffs. Pyromancer definitely is the more original and unique tree between the two and makes for very fun gameplay while still letting you play with fire and dots. The second magic weapon is the Life Staff. This weapon is the only one that scales with focus in the game and also is the only healing weapon. The two weapon trees are Healing and Protector. Healing has access to Divine Embrace, Sacred Ground, and Splash of Light. These abilities make for a combination of direct healing and healing over time through AoEs on the ground. Leveling this tree will make for various buffs, but also debuff removal and of course extra healing perks. If you want to take the role of a traditional healer upon you, the healing tree will make that happen for you. The second Life Staff tree is Protector, which has access to Orbs of Protection, Beacon, and Light's Embrace. These abilities not only heal yourself and your allies, but also do damage to any enemies hit. Leveling the Protector tree will add healing over time, AoE healing, and various buffs. If you want to play a more interactive healer with skill shots that also does damage as it goes about healing, the Protector might be something for you. Then we have the third magic weapon, and with that the final weapon on our list, which is the Ice Gauntlet. This weapon scales with Intelligence, and the two weapon trees it has are Ice Tempest and Builder. Ice Tempest has access to Ice Spikes, Ice Storm, and Wind Chill. These abilities make for AoEs that do damage and CC. As you go about leveling the Ice Tempest, your abilities damage and duration will increase, whilst you also get more debuffs and crowd control. You're once again looking at a traditional MMO class with the Ice Tempest, in which you have ice abilities that do AoE damage and offer crowd control. Then we have the second weapon tree, which is Builder. This one has access to Ice Pylon, Ice Shower, and Entombed. Definitely a more interesting weapon tree where you work with ice projectiles that do damage, ice walls that hinder your enemies, and a defensive ability that makes you invulnerable. Leveling this tree will grant you various buffs that also affect your allies, increase various effects of your abilities, and grant extra defenses. Where you take the part of the builder, you'll share your work with your ice pylons and will also have access to defenses whilst going about being an ice mage. I hope this guide helped you understand everything about the weapon system and also gave you an idea of what weapons you would like to play. As always, remember to have fun, and I'll see you next time.